Hello and welcome. In my presentation tonight, I'll be reflecting on my book, Tradition in the Frame, and will attempt to show how an ethnographic approach to the visual may enable us to grasp social experience and rethink one of anthropology's persistent problems, that is, exoticism and the nexus power and representation. I'm going to do a share screen. I'm showing you here the book cover on its own, on the left, and also an ethnographic finding. It's flyer found by a friend at a coffee house in the region where I did work, placed alongside a photo of a man that I had taken a decade ago on the coffee house wall, and that's the owner of the coffee house. And this, I'm putting it here because it's a sign of how photography can become entangled in ethnographer-interlocutors relationships over time. Now, the questions about how the visual may become illuminating for anthropologists are consequential. Firstly, from a historical perspective, if one considers the history of the visual in anthropology, as Crispini and others have shown, the initial enthusiasm for cameras in the 19th century was quickly succeeded by their rejection in anthropology, in professionalized anthropology, with the emphasis shifting to the invisible and structural, kinship, religion, and so on. And so a challenge this book takes up is to use the visual as a way of illuminating experiences beyond what we already know from other means. Briefly, Tradition in the Frame is a book about a society in Crete, especially in the highlands of Crete, I mean the island of Crete, in southern Greece, an area stereotyped for its ruggedness and tradition. The book is about how people negotiate this myth daily in their encounters with cultural producers, tourists, and others. And the book theorizes this relationship between a periphery and various centers, and that will become apparent, what I mean by centers and peripheries. And the book does that, theorizes that relationship by doing two things. First, it prioritizes visual culture as a primary domain of experience, and second, it heeds ambivalence as a social experience. Now, you'll rightly ask me why this focus on the visual in this region of Crete. This results from the book's commitment to ethnography. Consider the representation of highland Crete in Greece, an object of aversion to its criminality and uncouthness, but also of fascination for rugged tradition. So there is something very slippery in how Crete and especially the highlands are seen. And here there's an assemblage of different representations of Crete in Greece, but also internationally. So this slipperiness between the positive and the negative is registered in the uses of Crete as an emblem, from food products to anti-austerity protests. In all of these, the visual is absolutely key. In order for Crete to serve as a symbolic image, the male figure with whiskers, a headscarf, and a black shirt is necessary. The emphasis on Crete as a visible entity is complexified in Sfakia itself, which is the region that the book is about. First, Sfakians are fascinated by appearance, and they endlessly debate the worth of patrilineal families, clans, in association with ideas of good descent, which is linked to men's mustaches, tallness, blondness, and other traits. Further, Sfakians like Yanis, a man whose image I have here on the upper side, they are eager to trace images of male ancestors and put them up on their walls. And more recently, of course, this takes place online, as you can see on the upper right side. Yanis is on the upper left side, showing me an image he took with his, at the time, pre-smartphone mobile phone. Men also proudly embody this familial history by wearing breeches, headscarves, and so on in festivities or photo shoots that they stage. And at the same time, and this is where the ambivalent element comes in, they're deeply unsure. Are these performances effective or are they excessive? So emphasizing the visual, in summary, is a way of accounting first the construction of the area, how the area is constructed as an image, and secondly, in order to account for people's own interest in tradition. The photograph I have on the lower left further illuminates the other central theme of this presentation and of my book, which is power. Here, Manousos, a businessman from a coastal village, is contemplating a poster of an urban photographic exhibition where his deceased father is presented as an anonymous shepherd. This is the man you can see in the poster. This staring reflects the asymmetry whereby Sfakians look at themselves and their past in images produced by those who possess the cultural and economic capital necessary to represent them. So what kind of power is this? Give me one sec. So what kind of power is this? The easy answer is to say it's power because the trope of authenticity insinuates that Sfakians are backward savages. So there is a negative stereotype, and that's a frequent, I would argue, simplistic interpretation of exoticism, that it's about the negative. But I argue there's a second, more important aspect of hegemony in these representations. That is the demand that Sfakians conform to definitions of tradition articulated by those who are in more powerful positions than they are in representing the rural. So in the past, we had folklorists, musicologists, later on we had photographers, journalists, and I consciously used the term hegemony, which was first used and made popular by Antonio Gramsci in the early 20th century, as this is a question of dominance of a certain vision of what rural society is about, of what Crete is about in this case, of what's Sfakia. To give you an example, a pair of journalists who toured the area in the late 2000s, the first decade, and told me of their amazement at the hospitable tradition of locals, they later published an article in a newspaper in which they playfully noted that some Sfakians even use Bluetooth headsets or watch films. Any disruption of what they considered as traditional, of that position that they sought to ascribe to Sfakians, was immediately highlighted as incongruous, in other words. Now, the backdrop against which to consider all this discussion is Michel Foucault's notion of power operating via the production of categories and subjects. Here you can see notorious examples of colonial photography or of photography used in penal legal contexts. And that same idea of power operating by the production of subject is famously taken up by Said in 1978 in his book Orientalism, which makes it a problem for anthropology. To simplify, Said claimed that it was exactly the attribution of inferiority to the Orient by Western authors that made colonialism possible. One of Said's legacy today is that we use the term exoticism to mean powering over those represented. Now, there are various limitations to Said's proposition, like what to do with cases of fascination and desire for those represented. And here I have an instance from my field site. What do we do with cases, for instance, of a German tourist who returns a photographic portrait he took decades ago to this man's, the man on the left, son, and they cry together. Does this destabilize or merely affirm the overarching power dynamics between the tourist and the local? In the book, I put the Saidian perspective, which is the perspective about asymmetry and power and representation, in conversation with a certain tradition in studies of the Mediterranean and of Greece in particular, as in the works of Michael Hertzfeld and Vassos Argyru. To simplify, these works raise the problem of colonized consciousness. Put simply, the relationship between external expectations and the image that a peripheral society has of itself. And these authors argue that societies like Greece have suffered the cultural colonization of the West via their national elites. In other words, whatever identity people emphasize today, it shows simply their dependence and their victimization. For instance, a shepherd proudly performing or embodying tradition causes merely the onlooker's mockery. They will mock him as backward or uncouth. And tradition, at a more philosophical level, is an imported notion anyway, this idea says, and can at best offer short gains in the tourist economy. Now, this is an important model of how the center disenfranchises peripheries, but it sees stereotyping as totally efficacious. My book shifts instead the exploration of exoticism from the diagnosis of domination to seeing what kinds of experiences are produced within it. The book accounts for both the affective and the asymmetrical, subjection and momentary empowerment. I look at cracks in power and ask, what about the cultural productivity of tradition? How do people negotiate these dominant conditions? And that's why I use the metaphor of the frame in the title of the book. It doesn't only echo the importance Sfakians give photography in approaching tradition, which is something I spoke about in relation to staging, photo shoots, and so on. But the frame also helps us grasp in the title what I argue is the most poignant aspect of exoticism: the placement of subjects in particular positions, in particular frames, and the expectation that they perform in those frames in particular ways. Sfakians know they are expected to be traditional, and that's the complication and the ambivalent element. They know that they are expected to appear traditional, and at the same time, they want to enact tradition as their own. And they constantly debate what tradition is and what it ought to include. And to give you a sense of how I also use the frame as an ethnographic method, consider this slide. Whenever I took out a camera in my fieldwork, my first fieldwork, which began in 2006, during a feast or something that is invested with ideas of tradition, for instance, Rizitko singing, people would laughingly remove Coca-Cola bottles, or they would find my inclusion of artifacts like mobile phones bemusing, and they would ask me to remove them from my frame. And I began thinking of how these gestures of fixing objects in the frame echo an effort to edit elements widely in one's self-presentation, so as to be able to lay a claim on tradition. And I describe this perennial process of editing out and including things and tailoring as montage logic. It sutures together very contradictory expectations from observers, but also from the people themselves, the residents, and allows for some pleasure in tradition while constantly denying what is taken to be polluting. This gives you a sense of how urbanites' accusation that Sfakian's tradition today is fake because of their modern lifestyle, that's exactly what locals are most sensitive to, because this echoes their own anxiety that tradition cannot exist in the present. And this complicates the commonplace idea that it's the accusation of locals as savages that is really damaging to them, which is a commonplace idea in a lot of accounts of the region. In savagery, I would argue, there is fascination by observers about encountering danger, and locals often enjoy scaring observers, even though they're also anxious about what will these observers say after they leave, again, an ambivalent element. These negotiations, again, to emphasize the element of ambivalence, are part of a framework that is as deeply anxious as it is assertive. And the same goes for visitors' impressions. They are enthralled, but they may also be disgusted by Sfakian traditionalism. The positive and the negative coexists. Now, let me show you how Sfakian's visual representation has a raw aspect. As I discovered, the majority of human emblems of Crete, like those postcards you see here, are in fact deceased Sfakian men. They never gave their consent, nor did they know where their image would end up. These images were, as a rule, taken at the coffee house, where the old man invited the photographer to have a small raki, to buy him a drink, during which the latter, the photographer, snapped the picture. And then, as a sort of common story that I heard had it, one day some relative calls the subject, the photographic subject from the city, and playfully says, "Oh, you became a postcard." This coffee house scene, embedded in power, shows how a very agonistic society, I was jokingly threatened very often that I would be shot at by my interlocutors when I took out my camera, That same agonistic society can override its suspicion when a photographer plays the game of social intimacy as a guest and venerates male appearance. And it also shows how the photographer's own quest for the iconic merges with a local desire for male appearance. So it's the photographer who demands it, and it's also the resident who partly demands it, and it's that collusion there, that sort of field of encounter that creates that image. So this merging of the internal with the external level is also something I take up in the book, and I argue that key motifs in Sfakian's representation are a result of a synergy between the observers and the locals' desire for the traditional, and I call this cyclical synergy. For instance, what I'm trying to argue here is that these images are neither the fantasy of an urbanite, nor merely or purely a local self-image. They were created during an encounter that characterizes this region, which is visited by folklorists, botanists, travelers for centuries. These images that these specialists produce, then they become inflated when they are recirculated locally as the only available images of beloved kin. Take a look at these examples here. On the left, I have a motif employed by professional photographer Nelly in the 20s of the 30s, juxtaposing men of different generations, and it is then found in various local contexts by people who most likely had no idea of the image to the left. And the same applies to fundamental ideas in Sfakia, such as that of hierarchy between good and bad families, patrilines, clans, which this idea acquires an official stamp when it's published in that book you see on the right by a paleoanthropologist, Nikos Poulianos, but which my own work shows that it pre-existed the visit. So the idea, as I found out in my archival work, the idea that there's good and bad patrilines pre-exists the visit, but then this paleoanthropologist comes and he gives it an official stamp, and his book plays a huge role in this because people acquire the book and recirculate the book, and they look at this idea printed inside the book, so this acquires a new aura, the idea, but they partly access the book because they want to get hold of these images of their ancestors, like the image on the cover, which is a portrait of a Sfakian man. Now, to give you a better sense of the social lives that Sfakian men had as photographs, I'll show you briefly two cases, that of this man here, called Georgis Valiris, and this man here, called Manolis Nikoloudis. And you can see these are very different sites, an image by a photographer, Nelly, whom we just mentioned, but also his image on olive oil, bottles, postcards, food products, and then the man here, postcard on the upper left side by George Mays, postcard on the at a later stage, lower left, and then an image of him at the bus station in Crete, upper right. In these images, the subjects appear anonymous. They have no control over the framing or the use of the image, unlike the photographers. And note here on the postcards I'm showing on the left, on the lower left side, note the caption Crete in English. It's addressing the English-speaking visitor, and it frames the man as an emblem of Crete. It's indicative of the power structures that in Nelly's archive, and Nelly is the woman who took the picture on the upper left side, in the archive at the Benaki Museum, rural subjects are identified typologically, for instance, farmer / Crete, unlike upper-class Athenians who are named as individuals. And there are efforts at the archive currently to actually complicate and add information about subjects. These images reflect a particular understanding of the rural as pre-modern. One photographer even removes items reflecting modernity, upper left side, look at the image there, such as electricity pylons. The placement of others in temporal frameworks that differ from that of the metropolitan observer will be familiar to you, as it's been long recognized as a key Orientalist trope. Think here of Fabian's famous 1983 book. And this critique played a role in anthropologists turning away actually from the village as a research site. And there's a discussion today about whether the village still has a place in anthropology or whether a focus on the village reproduces problematic assumptions of boundedness. In my work, I show that the village is not only a meaningful category for people, but also how it becomes a key imaginary for national mechanisms, and it enables aspirations of rootedness for various actors. These actors may include non-Greek enthusiasts of Sfakia, some even with anti-German Brexiteering hopes, as I've found in more recent fieldwork, of a return to a bounded locale. And here you can see and appreciate how Sfakia is more than just a locality. It's also a site that evokes ideas about tradition, resistance, and it inspires different political practices. Following Greece's 2010 bailout deal by the EU and the IMF, actors across the political spectrum in Greece summoned Sfakia in the service of different sensibilities, from neoliberal exaltations of rural production to anti-colonial nativism against the EU. And this touches on a theme that is also explored in the book, that of tourists' romantic investments in Sfakia, and how this involves images that can be found today in local households as a result of exchanges and gifts between locals and tourists. Now, like with Nelly's work commissioned by the Metaxas regime in Greece, a key motif in the Valiris and Nikoloudis images, these images here, is the notion of and the displacement of the notion of rural tradition onto the male body. This fits the folklore studies notion of the local harmonizing with the national. In these images by Nelly, men appear usually in rural labor or traditional clothes with formal attire, but never with guns. This reduction into a symbolic figure has echoes in commercial logos that increasingly focus on essential signifiers, a mustache, a headscarf, in order to render Crete a unified image. So this is a digital sort of sequel of this in some ways. Now, so far I've been sketching an image of power from the perspective of production, which makes power look absolute. But let's look now at what happens when people get hold of images. So in my first fieldwork, which is in 2006, I take archival and commercial images back to Sfakia, and this is something I've done in all of my fieldworks up until very recently. And a recurrent theme that I find back from 2006 is people, once they look at these images that I found in archives or the market, they start uttering the names of subjects. They enthusiastically see them as relatives, ancestors, co-villagers. And I still recall my surprise when I first took out a bundle of postcards I had bought in Cretan towns at the coffee house. People gathered around me and they started shouting names, kinship ties, stories about these subjects' lives. Some children shouted grandpa. What was for me the national, the anonymous, the typological of this sort became something much more personal and affective for my interlocutors. Walter Benjamin described the capacity of photography to preserve details in the frame that may enable future viewings, even against the photographer's intention, with the term tiny spark of contingency. For him, the camera preserves whatever happens in front of the lens, and the political implication, of course, of this is that the content of the image may later problematize, question its original ideological framing. For my interlocutors, tiny sparks of contingency may include things like how Manolis Nikoloudis is holding his waist, or this man here, Georgis Karkanis, the way in which his tuft of his thick hair, tuft of which goes through his headscarf, as some spectators noted. These are tiny sparks. These are all things that are captured in the frame. Tiny spark of contingency could also concern the patches and the holes in those clothes worn by Sfakian sitters of the early 20th century, and a picture taken by Nelly, which caused people's tender laughter and unraveled their ambivalent perception of the past, an object of idealization for its wholeness, but also of disdain to its unbearable poverty and animosity, which I theorize in the book in a section on nostalgia. Some uses of these postcards in the present take a more decommercializing route. In recontextualizing, for instance, these postcards of Manolis Nikoloudis as familial images, note how the caption Crete is now, which was originally addressing the English-speaking tourist, is now covered. Of course, the fact that a postcard may be the only good image of a deceased relative is an indication, of course, of people's dependence on these powerful cultural producers. This is their only good image in a way. Another ubiquitous response to imagery was critique, both of the photographer's exploitative hit and run, and of locals' gullibility and narcissism in posing. Thus, my interlocutors rejected this staging here, this postcard here, as fake, and they said the church in the background was actually digitally added after the shooting. We don't speak of exoticism or enframing the sitter, the terms that we would use in anthropology, of course. They wouldn't talk about how this man is now with the church, he's placed in a folk religious rurality, nor do they envision a village without a church. And of course, they don't have the capacity to have this image withdrawn from the market. In fact, thinking again with ambivalence, they partly endorse that image and its connotations. But I argue their limited critique also expresses disdain to the logic of the anonymous shepherd type, and that we ought to listen to that critique. This is reflected, for instance, in the discrepancy between a folklorist's description of this same image. I showed this image to a folklorist in urban Crete, and the man said, "This is an excellent example, quote, of a specimen of the illiterate shepherding farming population, a man of bodily toils who proudly leads his traditional life," end of quote. My Sfakian interlocutors instead said that the photo does him no justice, does the subject no justice, since he is caught in one of life's downturns. They associate his beard with mourning rather than with a generic traditionality. And this discontent is made more apparent when people furiously insisted that I write down the names and details of subjects in the pictures that we discussed. Sfakian's critique of postcards is also entangled in a culturally specific discussion about egoismos. That is the extent to which it's acceptable for someone to promote oneself, which is an endless discussion in the area. This contestation, again deeply ambivalent, as it critiques those who pose while adoring images of men. This introduces an ambiguity at the core of postcard images. Were the subjects memorable men or gullible victims due to their egoismos? For instance, many Sfakians castigated the co-optation of people into structures like journalists' articles. That was very often, journalists would come and they would ask people to pose. This may translate sometimes into performing tradition by excluding external orchestrators. And I argue these performances of tradition, when the external orchestrators are excluded, they appear the same as the national palatable ones, but also contain small elements that make them unrecognizable. They might provoke shock, they might provoke fascination, aversion, but most importantly, they create the inability of outsiders to fully comprehend and to fully be in control of what's happening. And I call this in the book recalcitrant alterity. Also, in thinking about traditionalist performances today in the book, I theorize how men pursue embodying visual motifs from the 19th century photos of guerrillas fighting against Ottomans. Now, depending on who orchestrates this enactment, a local association or a filmmaker shooting a comedy about Crete, which I have a chapter to, by the way, dedicated to this in the book, all of these have different political potentials depending on the particular context of the enactment. And I theorize these as experiential historicism. This is an embodied, a visceral experience of history, despite and within this history's formalization. These experiences of the past, which again are deeply ambivalent, people told me that they shiver when putting on traditional attire, but they also question whether this is genuine today. They would look at a historical photograph as a prototype, as the primary, the original experience, and they would question the enactment, even though they were also really eager to do it. And all of this raises an important question. Are these in absolute continuity with national ascription, or do these enactments exceed the official? And I'm thinking here with subaltern studies and that tradition with respect to how struggles constituted by dominant structures can sleep sometimes beyond and haunt the conditions of their own constitution, which is a term I pick up in one of Gianprakash's articles. My argument is that traditional enactments no longer strictly serve the nationalist folklore studies agenda of the early 20th century. They become something else. They speak to wider assertions of difference, and they can slightly exceed the polished and palatable representation of rural tradition. And the illegal shooting of guns can be a good example of this. They can be incorporated into a national narrative about resisting the enemies, the national enemies, but they also cause the shock of official visitors, and they momentarily destabilize that relationship with officialdom. And there's a corollary political question. Can something reflective on androcentric nationalist hierarchies negotiate power at another level? How are we to describe this politically? And that's why I explore negotiations in the book as critical moments, ambivalent pleasures, and passing transgressions, rather than as consistent resistance. The last thing to say before I close is that this research for me has been an ongoing process. It started when I was a PhD student back in 2005. I've been lucky enough to return to the field site and engage with people over the years. That's over a decade now. One of the recent visual endeavors I got involved with was while I was conducting research in the framework of the ERC-funded project Photo Demos, led by Chris Pinion, based at UCL. So I curated and organized the photo exhibition in 2018. The exhibition focused on residents' own images of the recent phase of explosion of digital photography locally. And it was consciously framed, as you can see in the poster and the flyer, as an attempt to capture the historical shift, whereby Sfakians are now the producers of images of the area against a backdrop of a history of being represented by external specialists, the folklorists, the botanists, musicologists, and so on. Now, I'll just show you a few of these images, some of which introduce significant breaks with pre-existing motifs, and others which continue and re-embrace long-standing normativities. This is one which in some ways embraces normativities regarding the male body posing on a mountain, but this is another which is about the female body posing on a mountain and humorously engaging that context. This is about new objects that become publicly available, about new forms of body emerging in the landscape. And with this, I'd like to end. Thank you very much for your attention.